Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the Ramsay Centre's Distinguished Speaker Series for 2021. I'm Simon Haines, and our guest today is Gigi Foster, who is Professor and Director of Education in the School of Economics at the University of New South Wales Business School. As an economist, she works across a number of fields, including education, corruption, behavioral economics, and intriguingly, lab experiments, although we're not going there today. She publishes in numerous specialized and cross-disciplinary journals, and as a teacher in the Australian Awards for University Teaching 2017, Gigi was awarded a citation for outstanding contribution to student learning. She was also in 2019 named Young Economist of the Year by the Economic Society of Australia. Professor Foster writes for the popular press. She's regularly interviewed on mainstream TV. You may have caught her on Q&A not that long ago, and also on radio programs across the country. She co-hosts with Peter Martin, The Economists, a national talk radio program and podcast series now in its 5th season on Radio National on ABC. So now, with her two co-authors, Professor Foster has just published a hard-hitting book, just out, available on Amazon right now, bit of a plug here, published with the Brownstone Institute in Austin, Texas, and this is what she is going to tell us about. So a warm welcome to you, Gigi Foster. Very good to have you with us on the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Simon. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, the format today, as you know, is that our guest will speak for about 20 minutes and then we'll have a bit of a conversation. And so that's enough from me, just to tell you that the topic is the same as the title of Professor Foster's book, and that is The Great COVID Panic: What Happened, Why, and What to Do Next. So, Gigi Foster, over to you.
Thank you very much again, Simon, for that very kind introduction. And I do appreciate the opportunity to speak about this book, which is easily the most important thing that I've done this year. Here's the copy of it that I have right on my desk here, and I've been speaking about it with interviewers around the world, but it's a great pleasure to be speaking to your audience at the Ramsay Center. So I wanted to speak for my 20 minutes, not just about the ideas, because I'm sure we'll get into the ideas that are in the book in our questions and answers, but also sort of the genesis of this book, the motivation, and what our strategy was for trying to deliver its message. So this is a book that was birthed in despair, in frustration, in pain that I was feeling together with my two co-authors, Paul Freiters at the London School of Economics and Michael Baker, who is Australian and got his economics degree at the University of Western Australia. We, in March and April and May and June of 2020, were watching as the world went mad, and we felt increasingly impotent, unable to change this hideous direction that we saw policy moving in, and increasingly confused and perplexed and baffled at why it was that this horrible snowball was gaining speed. In March and April, I expected that the fear that had been possessing people clearly here in Australia and also around the world would dissipate within a month or two, and we would get back to more normal policy settings. We would rediscover our pandemic management plans, which had been in place before COVID and very sensibly did not call for wholesale lockdowns of healthy populations in response to a viral pandemic like this. But that didn't happen. And the months went by, and not only did the policy get worse and worse, but there was no defense of that policy being offered by our governments. There was no cost-benefit analysis proving, or at least estimating, that lockdowns would on net deliver benefits in terms of human welfare, in terms of human thriving, in terms of what economics considers its maximand, which is the best for people. And this was just frightening and depressing. And at the same time, we saw and we knew the pain that was going to be created, that had already been created, and that would stay with us for years to come from the actions we were taking. And that pain was going to be mainly felt by those who were initially already disadvantaged. So it was a great period of pain and frustration and sorrow for the victims of the COVID panic. And we wrote this book really as a tribute to those victims, and to try to express in the ways that we could, with our intellectualizing and our understanding of how the world works, and the best storytelling we could come up with, why this happened, and how we might try to move forward in the future to prevent such a tragedy from reoccurring. We include descriptions of things that people can do in different countries, and this is very much a book not just about Australia. This is about the worldwide phenomenon of the panic, but we draw a lot on Australian experiences, partly because I'm Australian. Now I live in Australia. I'm a dual citizen of America and Australia. Paul is lives in Britain, also is Dutch, and used to live in Australia. So we are covering quite a lot of the Anglosphere, shall we say, and the Anglo-Saxon world. But we do want to try to help people to give them some hope and some optimism that we were struggling to find ourselves in April and May and June of last year. So, in terms of the way that we approach our topic, we are all three economists, but we recognize that there are facets of this problem, facets of what's happened that really are not in the traditional purview of economics. And so we include chapters on, for example, viral spread, on crowd psychology, on political economy, which is more in the political science realm. It's about power and our understanding of power. And, I feel very lucky to be in the position that I am, to be where I was in March 2020, having already been researching many of these topics that are highly relevant to understanding the Great COVID Panic. Corruption, highly relevant to understanding, what has happened here. And those economists who hadn't been studying corruption will just naturally not have necessarily been primed to see how important some of those power dynamics have been. The same thing with crowd psychology. My mother actually was a psychologist, and I've been interested in behavioral economics and researching in it for a decade. And so understanding how crowds develop, it was something that was new. Was not understanding that crowds could happen was one of the reasons why some of us in March and April thought that things would pass rather quickly. But once you understand that there is such a thing as a crowd dynamic, it was a rediscovery for me as a social scientist of the importance of crowds, how crowds can people and create massive damage. And to rediscover in history how have these things happened. It was a great joy really as a scientist to be able to do that. But I was already primed to think about people as being influenced by their social groups, and having various kinds of psychological attributes that would influence their economic behavior in ways, again, that some mainstream economists simply wouldn't have already been primed to think about. And so I feel very lucky in that. And having already published a previous book actually with Paul, which talks a lot about groups and networks and loyalty and power, we were already thinking about this and researching about it again for close on a decade. So that, combined with the fact that I really don't have the kind of sensitivity to group rejection that a lot of people do. I was a very lonely child. I'm very strong as a person. I have a very strong family and group of close friends, but whether or not the group as a whole agrees with me is just not something that feeds strongly into my sense of self-worth. And so I was in a position to be able to go on air and say, this is madness. We should not be locking down the economy. You show me the proof that we should. I just don't believe it. And here are my arguments for why. So doing this book was part of that effort to bring all of my advantages, and including, my co-authors who are wonderful. And Paul has been a great friend and collaborator for many, many years. Michael is a brilliant writer. And to bring that message forward, because of the privileges that I had, and being able to serve the country and a lot of the people who don't understand what's happened and want a story for why it's happened and what can be done in the future to prevent something else like this. So that's basically how we initiated the project. And And then we had two main approaches stylistically. The first was to try to tell the story of the panic through the eyes of three characters.
Mm.
So we have Jane, James, and Jasmine. These are archetypes. Not everybody will be a pure form of any of them, but they do exemplify the very different sorts of reactions that people in the world had to what was happening. Jane is the very fearful, sort of insecure, rule following type who initially pressured her politicians to protect her from COVID when she got extremely scared from all the images coming in from around the world, from China, from Rome, etc., of this disastrous threat, and everything else had to be put aside while we dealt with this threat. So it was a very strong fear response from Jane that in many cases pushed the politicians into policies which would not have been conceived of previously. And then James, far from being scared by what was happening, he was calculating where he might be able to draw an advantage for himself. And James could be both in a government position or also in a company position. So James was at the head of corporations making personal protective equipment or hand sanitizer, right now vaccines, as well as in governments making deals with those companies to procure various things that the country supposedly needed in order to protect the population. So James has cleaned up during this period. James, the opportunist, he has seen advantage in others' pain, in the fear and the panic. He has gained in money and prestige. And right now he's thinking about how he can hold on to those advantages while the panic slowly fades. And then there's Jasmine, and Jasmine, of course, is the doubter, the critic, the one standing outside and saying, "What on earth is going on?" and sanity checking herself with the other Jasmines around the world. This is myself and my co-authors. This is probably many of our readers, and Jasmine feels the whole raft of human emotion during this period, and tries to bring her critical thinking skills to bear and her independent thought to bear on analyzing and understanding what's happened. So we use the literary device of these three characters sprinkled throughout the book, including some actual words in the language of actual Jasmines, and some taken from actual Janes posted to social media and whatnot, to try to really bring alive and make a human feeling around the reactions of these three types during the period, and how they furthered and developed the things that we've actually seen in terms of policy and responses and outcomes. And then, of course, because we're intellectuals, we have the intellectual side of the book, and so then we have very intellectual discourses about different aspects of the panic, and that includes the viral spread chapter. It includes a chapter on the failures of science during this period. It includes the crowd psychology chapters about the concentration in different industries, the power concentration, and how politicians have benefited, and indeed historical analogies to, for example, the Middle Ages and the feudal era, to how we live today. And indeed, it traces many of the developments that have been happening far before COVID for the last 20 to 30 years, really, that placed us into a very vulnerable position at the beginning of 2020, and have made us more, more kind of, I suppose, vulnerable to the negative kinds of dynamics that we've seen, and the extension of the 2 years now, almost going on to 2 years of this kind of policy craziness, and not figuring out how to break out. Certainly in Australia. We break the period of the COVID panic into three chunks. So we have the great fear at the start, the illusion of control in the middle, and then the end games at the end. And while we do sort of tether the marks in the sand between these periods to actual times, of course, it differs by country. And in Australia, for example, we're still very much in the illusion of control period, certainly in Victoria. New South Wales might be seeing the edge of hope in terms of getting out and seeing the end games. Other places like Sweden, basically not really been in the illusion of control phase. So they've had a very, very small period of that, if any. And other places like Texas or Florida are pretty much out of the madness now, and so they're in the end games. But it is kind of useful to think about the way in which the panic has progressed across those three periods. And so you can locate your own country in one of the periods and say, okay, this is where we're at, and these are the dynamics going on, and how do I then best address what I'm seeing in front of me and try to move forward. So that's basically what we do in the book. Now, in terms of sort of what we are hoping for from this effort, uh, one of the big things about this book that we try to provide as sort of as much as possible, that's in a way that speaks to readers who are not intellectual eggheads like us, is concrete actions that can be taken to improve institutions going forward. And I just want to speak about a couple of those, because I think it's important to think about optimism and think about how can we move forward in a hopeful and positive, coordinated manner. One of the problems during this period is that the resistance, or the coexistence, as we have sometimes been called, have a lot of trouble coordinating. There's a lot of censorship on the media, which we may talk about. There's just not being able to go out and socialize with people means that it's difficult to communicate, and so we want to provide some notion of actions that can be coordinated upon by Jasmines, essentially, and patriots around the world who love their countries and want to help them to really build back better, in terms of what can be hoped for. And we also emphasize that these are just our ideas as three economists. We will need the ideas of professionals across the disciplines to try to move us all forward. So we need legal thinkers, we need scientists, hard scientists, we need psychologists, we need all of the types to be bringing their skills and their muscle to bear on creative solutions to move forward together. But there are a couple of overarching themes. The first overarching theme that's important to bear in mind is the notion of diversity of thought. So, one of the big problems during this period has been that governments have been hijacked by the notion that there is a single truth, and they have pushed that fiction successfully onto their populations. So, phrases like the science is settled or follow the science, right? This implies that science is dead, that there is no more debate, that we sort of know with a full stop exactly what the problem is and how to attack it, and therefore what you should personally do. Right? That kind of mentality is the mentality that characterizes a totalitarian system, where there is concentration of power in the hands of a small group, and that small group purports to have a monopoly on truth. And that's extremely dangerous. And when a democratic state like Australia allows itself to be hijacked into that kind of narrative, it becomes very stupid very quickly. And that is what happened here. When people back in 2020, like myself on Q&A in April 2020, tried to voice an alternative position, what we were met with was not respectful engagement and a desire to really hash it out and figure out where the truth, or the most useful truth at that moment might lie, but rather with cancellation attempts, disparagement, discrediting. I think I was defamed on Twitter, even though I'm not even on Twitter, right? So those kinds of responses are very damaging and a very bad sign for the health of the population and of the agora, of the public space. And so that is probably the biggest lesson, is that we need to work out ways that we can increase the diversity of views that is accepted and embraced around the table of decision making whenever we are facing problems or crises like this in the future. So we suggest a few different mechanisms of actually achieving that kind of goal or moving in that direction. One of them is to establish alternative schools of thought in different disciplines. And so this is an idea where the public purse, would be asked to underwrite the development of completely different ways of thinking than what we see in the mainstream. And I suppose, Simon, in the Ramsay Center, you'll be familiar with the kind of hijacking of much of what is called free thought within universities today under a particular ideological banner. We see that as quite ill and not the right way to be conceptualizing what a university should stand for. We want a lot of diversity of views. We want different perspectives. We want them all to be coming to the table, and we don't want academics feeling that they can't speak their minds about something because some crowd, some group is going to say that that's not an okay way to think. That's very dangerous. Whenever it's not okay to have thoughts, we're moving towards a dystopian kind of system. So what we suggest is that the government could move from discipline to discipline and finance the development and growth of a completely different school of thought that would live for maybe 20 years or 10 years and then lose its government funding. And if it had been successful in that period, it would keep going. And if not, it would die. But every year, there's a different discipline that gets this kind of infusion of subsidization of new thought. And the hope is that that will help to break the stranglehold of the monopoly of truth, one truth that we see in not just economics, but many other sciences today as well. So that's one idea. The second idea is to wrest control of the leadership of core ministries in governments from the politicians who at the moment appoint leaders to ministries and put that control into the hands of a citizen jury system. So instead of having politicians appoint, say, the head of the Ministry of Education, you form a jury of citizens who deliberate and are on that jury for, say, 3 months or 6 months, and they do research about who would be a good minister of education, and they appoint the person, and then the jury disbands, and each member of that jury probably never serves on another similar jury again. But everyone in the country is, in principle, a member of the jury system. And so you can sort of have your number come up, just as you do with respect to criminal juries. And so we feel this would be a mechanism of embedding more direct democracy in a way that really matters, because instead of just forcing people to go to the ballot box every time there's a general election, and people don't really spend that much time preparing, they just say, okay, whatever, I'll just vote for this. You actually set up a system where you've concentrated the input of the citizen upon a particular thing, where his actions on a small jury of, say 20, 30 people can really make a difference. And so he has an incentive to really care and prepare and do his best, bring his best to the table in that effort. So those are two examples of where we are hoping that we'll be able to move as a society, and where we would like to encourage Jasmines around the world to collaborate and try to push forward. In the meantime, maybe some of the Janes and James in this world will also find themselves, interested in the book enough to read it and hopefully come to some sense of reconciliation, because that is one thing we need very badly after this period, is to reconcile with each other across the aisle, across our belief systems, across our interpretation of what's happened, and be able to move forward together.
Well, thank you very much, Gigi Foster. A very challenging and as you say, somewhat contrarian presentation, because it may be that the things you're saying and that the suggestions that you're making for the future will become more mainstream and less controversial as we emerge from the lockdown and move forward. We arrive at the 80% and the 90% and so on. But you have, as you say, run into a lot of resistance, a lot of hostility. You've indicated, censorship, Twitter storms, and so on. So I wonder whether I can just kind of begin by trying to give voice to that kind of alternative, but the one that you've been fighting against, the alternative point of view about lockdowns, what you might call the sort of person in the street response to what you say in the book. And that would be, and I can say this as a non-economist, so it's very much a sort of non-specialist response. Surely our leaders and our policies haven't been too bad. I mean, we've had in Australia, we've had one of the lowest rates of infection and death from COVID in the whole world. We've had one of the best economic outcomes from the last 2 years, although admittedly the IMF report that came out a couple of days ago wasn't too great about how we've gone, but nevertheless, vaccine rates are getting there after some major glitches with supply and uptake earlier on. This was a completely unprecedented event in the modern world. Isn't it a bit unfair to bag our poor old leaders, the politicians, the health authorities so strongly? We have muddled through. They had to make a call. There wasn't much time. There was a clear and present danger. There were awful images on TV screens from India, from Italy, from China. Apparently an exponential growth in cases, dreadful worst case scenarios, all of that. Somebody had to act with direction, somebody had to act with strength, make the call. And I'm remembering a year ago, a very large group of your colleagues, fellow economists in Australia, including many of the most distinguished names in the profession, wrote a public letter where they commended Australian governments, state and federal, for their firm action, which bought time for the health services, bought time for vaccines to be developed, saved us having to cope with what looked like it might be tens of thousands of deaths and a collapsed hospital system. It's all very well with 2020 hindsight, they might say. How can you possibly know without the lockdown that they did how bad the outcomes would have been? I mean, there was a report, wasn't there, just out, a parliamentary committee in the UK, I think it came out a couple of days ago, saying that the government should have locked down harder and earlier than it did in the UK. So, comments, Gigi Foster.
Look, excellent questions and very well articulated as to the alternative position. So I appreciate that. And I wish we'd been having this conversation 14 months ago, 15 months ago, and on public television, right? With ministers all around. So the first thing to say is that when people point to our COVID outcomes and our economic outcomes and our actions, our policy actions, there is a very strong temptation, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, which are island nations that have closed their international borders, to be seduced into thinking that correlation is causation. In other words, that because we have done these policy actions of having these very draconian domestic lockdowns, preventing people from moving, all this stuff, that is what has caused our excellent, comparatively, results on COVID deaths and suffering. In fact, what is likely to have happened is a combination of two things. One, we closed the international borders, and that prevented a large amount of virus coming in. And so if we had done that and just let everybody else get back to business within the country, we would have had probably a very similar kind of result in terms of COVID. But the second thing is that even if we'd kept those international borders open, Australia has a position demographically and geographically which would predict, based on what's happened elsewhere in the world with this virus, that we actually wouldn't have particularly bad results on COVID anyway. We are in a reasonably low density kind of population structure. We have, pretty good healthcare system relative to a lot of countries. We are in the Asian region where many sweep over us, and have done so over the last many years. And it does seem in Asia that COVID has not taken as many people, which may be partly to do with deep immunity that we have in this region. We've got a lot of Chinese people coming through Asia, a lot of other people from Asia. And so it's quite possible that will have protected us. Plus, we've got a lot of vitamin D. It's very sunny, and vitamin D seems to be important in this virus. So there are a constellation of factors which would make one think that we would have done it pretty well anyway. And I will then broaden that statement to say, if you look across the world and correlate the stringency measures that have been put in place by countries around the world with their COVID outcomes, there is not the wonderful effect that is claimed by lockdown proponents. It's just not the case that you cause good outcomes by locking down. In fact, you end up having, if anything, the reverse causation, and any reduction in deaths that happens in a particular country happens way after the lockdowns initially occur. So it's not as though there's any sort of real relationship. It's just that the virus is going to do its thing. It's going to have its sort of seasonal waves, and it's going to attack more the places that are more vulnerable for these demographic and geographic reasons that I just explained. So this correlation versus causation story is a problem, and it's one of the biggest sources of confusion, even in first-year economics students, is to confuse, because it's so seductive to do so, to confuse correlation with causation, and the politicians will take advantage of that, and they have, and that's what we've seen here in Australia, is this story of the hero protector politician, when in fact we've just gotten lucky, right? The lucky country yet again. The second thing to say is, in terms of the actual economic results, the GDP figures that we've seen have been significantly supported by the fact that we've kept a lot of rich people, all of our rich people, in the country. And as it turns out, rich people like to spend. And in fact, they spend more than the tourists whom we usually get coming in when our rich people go out will spend in any given year. And so there's been a real support for our GDP, which is artificially created by having trapped people in the country. And so that's one of the sort of signs and signals that not everything is necessarily doing as well as it seems to be based on statistics. And I am a bit worried of what will happen when we open up the borders and we let all these rich people go overseas. The other thing is that just in terms of general total effects, even the idea that we can judge what has happened so far based on our outcomes, quote unquote, is quite superficial, because many of the actions we've taken during this period have long-term effects. We have accumulated a ginormous amount of debt. We have damaged the education of all of our children who have had their schooling disrupted, and that will be with them for their whole life. We have created really negative habits in a lot of our workers who don't want to go back to work now, and babies and toddlers and small children who now think it's dangerous to go to the playground and play with their friends. We've damaged people. And that damage, in my book, counts. But to just look at sort of COVID and economics and look, oh, everything's fine, it's very superficial. And so we need a more thorough analysis. The final thing I'll say is this action, this response to, well, we needed to do something, someone needed to do something. That is the politician's syllogism. And if you don't know what it is, you should watch Yes, Prime Minister. It's a wonderful program which tells you about the real workings within a government. And exactly as that syllogism says, governments essentially need to be responsive to what they feel the people want, in some sense, in a democratic state. And so again, in March and April, the people were extremely scared. They were putting pressure on the politicians to do something. And the politicians needed to be seen to do something, even if that something was not connected, actually, with reducing the perceived threat. They just needed to have some sort of story that would sell on the street. And so the idea of locking down in order to combat this virus, it was a story people were willing to swallow because it gave them hope. It gave them some mechanism of trying to reduce their own fear inside them. It wasn't really going to work, and we knew this before COVID because it was already embodied in our pandemic management plans, right? So we already knew that this was a bad idea, but it was the pressure from the people that was causing this action. And it was often defended, including by those economists you mentioned, Simon, those 200 plus people who signed that no trade-offs letter in April. It was defended on the basis that we needed to apply the precautionary principle. We needed to, if an avalanche is coming, you've got to get out of the way, right? That presumes, first of all, that having lockdowns is a way of getting out of the way, which was simply not proven. We had no proof that was the case. There was just this superficial story about, well, people in their houses, they won't interact with each other and maybe they won't pass the virus, right? There was no consideration of where exactly are people going to be if they're not out and about. Well, they're going to be in the houses and sharing the house with each other, and the sort of stress of being out of the broader environment is going to cause all sorts of other possible health problems. There was nothing about that. It was just this very superficial story. And this notion that that was going to work then was coupled, which was fallacious. We didn't have any proof of it. Was coupled with a complete blindness to the risks, the precautionary principle application on the other side of the policy. Maybe it was dangerous to employ this radical policy that we didn't, but was unproven, because it might have extreme risks that we weren't sure about, just like the virus might have some risks we weren't sure about. It wasn't like there was certainty on either side. So it was very disingenuous to apply the precautionary principle just to one side of the picture in that sense. So I guess those are the main things that I would say. I mean, the idea that we somehow didn't have the knowledge about how bad this virus was in March and April is also completely wrong. I mean, how did I know? Because I was looking at the data. There were data on who is this virus really vulnerable for. And I was advocating in late March on my radio program, we need to protect the vulnerable people, the elderly, and we need to let everybody else get back to work, because this is just not a huge threat for people under 50. Now, of course, yes, it has characteristics that are scary. Sometimes it takes out somebody young in a very scary way. That's true. But it's very unlikely to do that relative to its risk to the old. And so the old have actually suffered during this period because of our scattergun approach of locking everybody in their homes rather than focusing on the actual needs of the people who are truly vulnerable to this virus. And that includes even now, when we have this blanket approach of vaccinate everybody, instead of focusing the vaccine supply and the early treatment options, which exist, by the way, on the people who really, really need that help. And that's what we should be doing. That's what we would do in normal times. And the fact that we're not is a signal that we're still not out of the illusion of control phase.
Thank you. And I hope we'll have time to come back to what you were saying earlier on about how we should proceed going forward. including, I think you've called for a world anti-hysteria organization to be set up a bit along the lines of the WTO. So on that question of hysteria, then, you mentioned this in your opening talk. Talk to us a bit more, Gigi, about threat, about fear. I mean, this you've got a very good chapter on this in your book, and you talk about the role of that little bit of the brain called, I believe, the amygdala. Sounds like a character
That's
out
right.
of Star Wars, but that's the name of the so a visceral kind of primeval fear receptor, which is also very susceptible to crowd behavior and crowd psychology, crowd emotion, like a contagion itself, just as catching as COVID. In classical Greek, as you know, the myth was that this was unleashed by the god called Pan, hence the word panic. Now, I don't know whether you've come across this. I recall a wonderful experiment done a few years ago. I think it was published in Science by a group of Harvard psychologists. It was called Prevalence Induced Concept Change. You've probably come across this one. It demonstrates how human beings can be, once they're sensitized to a threat, then they continue to perceive the threat even when it's completely disappeared. And the example that always comes to my mind is a herd of gazelles in the African bush who think they see a leopard in a tree. And even though there hasn't been a leopard there for a long, long time, and even if the leopard did kill a gazelle, it would only be one and the rest of the herd would be fine. Nevertheless, they bolt across the river to different grazing where there's no food, and they all starve just because they thought they saw a leopard. So so tell us a bit about this. Tell us about fear and threat and the role of crowd psychology, the madness of crowds in the story of the last 2 years.
Sure. So yes, the crowd aspect has been the great discovery for me as a social scientist during this period. One of the great discoveries, which has been very very joyful for me. So fear is unique amongst the human emotions because it basically shuts everything else down. The other emotions we can feel, and we can still react normally to other stimuli while we're experiencing that emotion, whether it's joy or sadness or frustration. We can experience these things, anger, and we can still kind of act normally, and we recognize other things are important. But with fear, every other emotion gets second place, or even third or fourth place, and every other stimulus other than the thing that we believe is threatening us recedes in importance. So it's almost like like your eyes have just completely left their ability. They've no longer any ability to see anything in the periphery, and they're just laser focused on one thing, whatever that thing is that you are perceiving as a threat. And we as humans, of course, we have the frontal lobe capacity, and we can use that to talk ourselves down from a fearful state, right, to control our emotions, as we teach our children to do, right, when they're babies, I hope. But we've had to do that less and less, I think, in our recent life, in our modern society. And many people have gotten out of the habit, really, of adequately and appropriately and maturely controlling their fears. And that is one of the things that primed us to be vulnerable to this global signal of, oh my gosh, there's a new virus and it's killing people, that was coming out in March. And part of that, habit forming is done through social media, where you don't really have to control what you're saying. You can just lash out, or say something in a fit of pique, and nobody really reprimands you for that. There are no real social consequences for that. And so when people are allowed by their environment to indulge in that sort of thing, in that sort of uncontrolled emotional fit, then they are getting out of the habit of intellectually and maturely controlling their own fear. And so I think we had a population that was primed to have its fear run away with it even more than would otherwise have happened. And of course, the onslaught of media images and messaging from even our governments saying, giving us even more fear, right? Fanning the fear really did not help. I mean, there have been times in the last couple of years that even I have felt really seriously scared much, right? But it's hard to keep your complete composure when you're being bombarded by these very fearful images. So fear is unique amongst the emotions in that way of pressing everything else out. And that's one of the reasons why it is a very potent contributor to the genesis of crowds. And we've seen crowds in history. We've seen them, for example, in the witch hunts. We've seen them in the Prohibition period. We've seen them in 1930s Germany develop. And what happens in a crowd is that, exactly as within an individual person who is extremely fearful, the crowd's obsession, one particular obsession, is the only thing that its members are thinking about, and they bind together around that obsession. And there's this gift of togetherness that the crowd provides to its members, which you don't have with just within yourself, right? When you're feeling scared, you're just feeling alone and scared, and it's very horrible, and oh no, right? But if you have a crowd where everybody else is also obsessed about this one thing that's obsessing you, you feel together with them. You feel a sense of belonging. And people deeply, deeply need to feel that they belong. They must, for their own health, mental and physical, really, they must feel that they are accepted, tribe, a place. This is why these rituals like pointing the bone and ostracizing people from the group really work to hurt people a lot. They hurt the ostracized because we are social animals. We need to belong. And so a crowd offers that sense of belonging in spades, as long as you accept the obsession, as long as you give your mind over to the obsession and the notion that the crowd itself will become the arbiter of truth and the arbiter of morality. You will
So
no longer be one thinking about this. That delivers then the benefits to you.
that's it's very interesting, and it prompts me to ask you another question, which and this is a kind of going forward question about how we deal with this kind of thing in the future. I mean, it seems almost certain that this will happen again at some point. I mean, there's no shortage of either bats or gain of function experiments in the world, right? So one way or another, let's not go there, but one way or another, this is going to happen again. So one very important part of all of this and the fear reaction that you're talking about is surely the adequate explanation of risk. And I'd be interested to hear what you think about risk. I mean, after all, it doesn't take long on the internet to see that there have been about 4.5 million deaths from COVID. The world population is 8,000 million, so it's 0.05% of total mortality rate. Probably in the same period, 100 million people have died of all sorts of other causes. And you set that against the Spanish flu, and again, this is just roughly, but 1 in 3 people in the entire world caught the Spanish flu, and 1 in 10 of them actually died. So these are huge numbers. Many of them also were young and they were in the prime of life. My grandmother died in the Spanish flu and she was in her 40s, whereas now the average age of death from COVID is higher than the average life expectancy, at least in developed countries. So, but at the same time, how do we set that against the psychology that almost every one of us is either 70 years old, or, I mean, we aren't, but we have a parent who is, or we have a grandparent who is. How do we think about the risk as against that perceived, oh my goodness, grandma's going to catch this? This is the risk figures go one way, but the psychology goes another way. How do we resolve that dilemma in the future?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing to say is that in normal times, our governments help us to resolve that dilemma by their very resource allocation decisions. So, we face choices every day about where to allocate health resources. And if a liver comes in the door at a hospital and you've got two possible recipients, one of them is 80 years old, the other one is 20, where's your money on which person they give the liver to? Right. And the fact that that decision happens, it's heart wrenching, it's gut wrenching, but the fact that it happens is an illustration that we do not live in resources and organs grow on trees. We must make decisions across multiple different competing priorities, and life is short. It ends. Right. So part of the answer is to say, recognize that our societies today provide such an amazing quality of life on the back of doing resource allocation decision making in the back room in ways that people don't like to look at, but it happens all the time in order to promote as much human life and as good quality human life as we can get in a world where resources are still scarce. And the second is to recognize that death is a part of life. And the person who is 70 or 75 or 80, they should feel happy that they have had a great life and be able to enjoy it as much as possible, of course. But something is going to eventually get them. Right? I mean, my father, who is 90, says I'm not worth killing, and I tell dad, look, just please don't say that. All right. It's unpleasant. But when you get to a particular age, I mean, I certainly hope that when I'm 80, I'll be saying to myself, well, you know what? I've had a good run and I'm going to enjoy every moment that I've got left, just as I have, the past 80 years. But I'm not going to waste my gift of life on worrying and obsessing and stressing and stressing everyone else out about the possibility that I might die, and it's going to happen eventually. So let's not waste our life worrying about death, right? So a more mature attitude about death is one of the things that I do hope will be coming out of this period. But it's hard to see how that will happen. And I've tried to raise my children with that attitude, but gosh, it's a very deep philosophical position, really,
It is.
spiritual position.
Indeed, it is, and the spirit and values frameworks around death are something that a huge topic. We could spend another hour or two on that one. But look, let's move on to the next question, which really arises from something that you said in your opening remarks, and it's about diversity of thought, Gigi, about what you call in the book radical diversity. And I was interested in this because, as you referred to, the Ramsay Center for Western Civilization has had its own issues to deal with around diversity of thought. And you say in the book that the three pillars of Western civilization, and you use this phrase, are the market economy, democracy, and science, right? And you use this notion of radical diversity as a kind of way of understanding our freedoms of thought and behavior and assembly and so on, a way of explaining the separation of powers, which lies behind democracy, the free and open exchange of ideas, which lies behind scientific discovery, competing ideas about what the truth is, competitive coexistence in the world in the exchange of goods and services, the core of free markets and therefore of prosperity, all of that. And on the other hand, against this radical diversity that you advocate, you're very down on oligopolies, cartels, large-scale market fixing by unholy alliances, of managerial political technocracies, professional politicians that your James character in your book. Which, by the way, just as an aside, you said people like this see advantage in others' pain. Uh, Dame Sarah Gilbert applauded at Wimbledon for the development of the AstraZeneca, vaccine. Somebody who sees advantage in others' pain. Not sure about that. Anyway, if I had this right, you think we need to be very careful about what you perceive as a drift into a sort of monoculture in these different core pillars of Western civilization. Do you see that indeed as a threat to our civilization going forward? This convergence into a monocultural way of thinking.
Yeah, I certainly do. Let me first address your issue of profiting from pain. I don't think
Mhm.
that all of the Jameses from the very beginning were out to just grab for themselves regardless of the cost. I think many of them only came to exploiting the opportunities in front of them after a great and forthing and having to come up with rationalizations in their own mind to excuse their actions, because they do have morals, and they don't like to see people hurt, and they really have no intention to create even more pain. But the person who stands up and applauds for somebody in the public, she's getting what she's trying to do, at least in part, is to get some approval for herself. It's a virtue signal, right? So there is gain there that she's getting. Now, is it on the back of pain? Not necessarily, right? You can argue about whether or not it's a good thing that the AstraZeneca vaccine got that kind of public endorsement, but certainly in terms of her action, it's not that it's a sacrificial action. By no means is it. It's actually it's a self-serving action. And that was the case for again many of the Jameses, but many of them will have had to come up with these rationalization structures in their minds. So it's not that they are evil people. I would not say that at all. But in terms of whether we're really in danger of being sort of hijacked by a monoculture, yeah, I am worried about that. I'm worried about it, particularly in a society like Australia, where because we have a small marketplace, we end up
Mhm.
having concentrated industries already. And we have, as you may know, a system already of sort of gray corruption that occurs between leaders of the public sector and leaders of the private sector, because we have quite a number of industries which are highly regulated, where profits depend upon government. And so there are the very high returns to engaging in that sort of favor exchange. And actually, this system, if you'll forgive me, has been highlighted in this other book by my co-author, Paul Frieders and Cameron Murray, called Game of Mates, How Favors Bleed the Nation. My favorite book title, actually, probably ever. And so in that sort of scenario, it is very much, we are more vulnerable to losing sight of the importance of competition, not just in an economic realm, but also in a political realm. And I will say, from a personal standpoint, and really for all of us economists, authors of this book, we are taught in economics that there is an optimal solution to any given problem, right? And if you really take that to heart, then you start thinking in the direction that there is one truth. There's one way, there's one right approach, and that is just not very helpful when you scale it up, right? It's helpful maybe when you're looking at a particular optimization exercise, a sort of dynamic programming problem, or constrained optimization or something on the paper in mathematics. But when you start talking about how should we run a country, that notion of a single optimal way really is much less helpful. And I think, if anything, it's this sort of meta thought of the optimal way is that there is no optimal perfect position on any given policy, and that we always need to keep this sort of debate and engagement with alternatives going on, even though there's going to be an efficiency cost there. And that's another part of the seduction of the monoculture, is that it feels so much easier. It feels easier for the individual person because they don't have to think anymore. They simply accept whatever the monoculture is saying. But secondly, it feels like it's more efficient, even at a group level, because you don't have to engage in that painful, time-consuming, trying to understand other people, is it really, we can't, is that, I don't even know what you're saying. You can imagine the cost in terms of time and mental effort in a boardroom where you have 8 people sitting around who really have radically diverse ideas, right? It's a difficult ask, but that is the best, most healthy model. That is one of the lessons we take from this period for us to move forward with. So we need to be willing to bear that cost and to come to the party prepared to roll up our sleeves and engage with each other in order to try to discover what is best to do in any given moment. And the winning idea in any given policy decision will be different from the winning idea in something else potentially. And we shouldn't let those monopolies of thought emerge.
Thank you. I want to come back just at the end to your 2 major proposals going forward for the future. But before we do that, just to squeeze in one other question, Gigi, which is, and I guess it is a kind of monoculture question. Why haven't more people been speaking out on behalf of the poorest countries and the most disadvantaged groups in our own society during all of this? This is the thing that I find quite extraordinary. I mean, world debt is now 3 or 4 times as big as world GDP. Inflation's beginning to kick in. Interest rates are going to go up. The poorest countries are simply going to stop being able to manage their debt servicing, and decades of slow improvement in nutrition and health in all those countries is all being undone. How do we cost all of that against the benefits of the lockdowns, all those saved lives? And then there's the parallel story domestically, right? I mean, those who are not in middle class, salaried, comfortable jobs in the public sector or the private sector, people who are self-employed, who run cafes and bars and salons and non-essential tradespeople, lost their livelihoods in huge numbers in the lockdown. Wealth inequality has been massively enhanced, just as on the global scale, big pharma, big tech, big finance have become richer and richer while small businesses get swallowed up. Surely this is a hugely perverse outcome of the lockdown panic, that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. There's the basic psychology. Deaths are terrible. We see these images of people in the streets because there's no room in the ICU wards. But nobody talks about what's going to happen in the long term in the poorest non-developed countries. What's that all about?
Look, I mean, you've said it very well. The effects of our policy choices have been incredibly regressive. And one of the great shocks during this period for me has been the absence of the left on the side of sense. It's been very difficult to find friends for our position on the left side of politics. And I don't really think of myself as being left wing or right wing per se. When I was, in my crazy youth, I was definitely more left wing. I'd be in the Greenpeace marches and rallies and stuff, and I'd be, saying down with the capitalist pigs. But I've found friends amongst people during this period who think that Hillary Clinton is a lizard person, and by contrast, I've been completely canceled by people on the left side who, in normal times, bleat on about the welfare of those very people who have been most affected negatively and damaged for decades because of our actions during this period. What on earth has happened? So it really does make you think that a lot of that proclaimed care by many on the left was really just virtue signaling. I mean, I've really had to reassess what did people mean when they said they really cared about people in Kenya or people in Chad or in wherever, or the lower, disadvantaged classes here in Australia. What did they really mean? Did they actually mean they cared? Or did they mean that they just liked the feeling of being a person who was seen to care? That's been very sobering to me to consider. So yes, I completely agree. And I will say just finally that, in terms of the costs that we have visited upon ourselves, we haven't spoken about this very much, but we have in this book, of course, a chapter called The Tragedy, which is chapter 5, which enumerates those costs, and both for the developed world and for the developing countries. And I, as well, in August of last year, 2020, presented a draft cost benefit analysis to the Victorian Parliament of lockdown policy, where I enumerated the classes of costs that we would be feeling because of lockdowns. And they do not just include those short term, loneliness and social isolation, mental stress costs, which are huge. And they don't just include things like suicides. People point to the fact that suicides haven't changed that much in Australia, and they say, well, look, there's not much of a cost. What a shallow analysis. What a shallow analysis. I mean, the other costs are everything from crowded out healthcare for things other than COVID, to disruptions to schooling, which are going to cause our children to carry disadvantage going forward, to less money in the future to pay for everything from roads to infrastructure to, hospitals to schools to everything else, because we're not going to have as high GDP where we have to service the debt and all of that. So there are these massive costs, not to mention the fact that we've seen ourselves sacrifice our freedoms almost, in a heartbeat for something that just wasn't worth it. So that's a real reckoning we'll have to do with our national character. And we've damaged our brand overseas. So I don't expect we're going to get the kind of storms of tourists and even students that we did previous to COVID, because they've seen what can happen in Australia. They've seen this totalitarian nightmare emerge. So we've done incalculable damage. And well, we try to calculate it, at least to some extent, in our book, but that the full reckoning will not be known for many years because of the longer term nature of many of these costs. So I completely agree with you. I hope that the left finds a way to move forward after this negligence that they have demonstrated en masse towards those who are normally their main constituency. And I hope that there can be a reconciliation as well in families and in professional groups. I hope that I'm accepted in the economics profession moving forward, although I sort of don't think I will be for a little while. But there is definitely a large number of rifts that I think it would be very good for us as a country to repair moving forward.
So finally, and very briefly, your two sort of principal recommendations for going forward for the future. The one about establishing alternative schools of thought as a way of fostering radical diversity of thinking. As you can imagine from where I sit, this is something I couldn't possibly, furious agreement would be what I'd say with that one. I think that's brilliant. The other one, though, resting control of leadership of core ministries in favour of citizen, what do you call it, citizen juries?
Citizen juries. Mm-hmm.
That seems to me like a very tough ask. I don't know how you think that's ever going to happen, but a very long term prospect, surely.
Yes, I mean, I do agree it's a long-term prospect for sure in terms of embedding it as a system. But I will say there's a new development here in Australia that's been going for a few years that has some promise and has some features of what we're asking for. It's called New Democracy. And basically, they have a project-based approach where they target a particular level of government that is facing a particular policy question. And they have a whole system that they have sort of honed over the last few years, a jury or citizen panel, they call it a citizen jury actually, around this issue, and have deliberation of the options include these citizens as well as some politicians. And there's an authority that the citizens are given in advance, and there's a particular request. So this is what we ask you to deliver, and this is what you will have the power to do. And they work together with politicians, and this has been very successful in a number of cases. I just had a call with the person who runs the New Democracy Project, which is entirely philanthropically funded. They have basically one private funder who just funds them every year. And I think that development has a lot of progress, and they're outlined in our book, but it's got very similar flavors of bringing more direct democracy into important decision making. So I'm all in favor of that. And if you'd like to, if you're interested in this, if you're an audience member, look up New Democracy. It's a good starting point.
Okay, terrific. Well, look, it's all been really fascinating. Gigi Foster, thank you so much for talking to us. We hope all of this will be a radically diverse debate in the coming years as we reflect on what's just happened and what might be happening in the future. But on behalf of all of our listeners, thank you so much for speaking to us. It's been terrific. And of course, to our listeners, stay tuned for the next episode in the Ramsay Center's Distinguished Speaker series coming up very soon. So thank you, Gigi Foster. And this is Simon Haines saying goodbye for now.
It's my great pleasure. Thanks for having me, Simon.